I'm Lauren, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Gingham Scrunchie take-home craft. So, to get us started today, you should have your one long strip of the gingham fabric, a piece of elastic about 8 inches long, a teeny tiny spool of thread, which is more than you should need, and then this little piece of felt, which has 5 pins and 1 needle. And the pins are the ones with the little white ball up top, and the needle is the one with the one sharp end, and then the other end has, if you look really closely, an eye on it, which is a hole that we'll put the thread through, and that's what we're going to use to do our sewing. These other pins are just going to be used to hold the fabric in place while we sew. So, to get started, I'm just going to show you the fabric we have here. Now, this is a woven gingham, and when I say it's woven, I mean that the pattern is woven into it. Like the threads are black, and then the threads are white, and then when they cross over, you get this sort of gray here. It's not a pattern that's been printed onto the fabric. And the reason that's important here is, A, it helps us kind of know which lines to sew along, because we're sure that that will match the grain line. And the grain line is the direction that the threads were going when they were woven into the fabric. So a woven fabric will normally have a warp and a weft. And if you've ever used just a basic loom, you'll know that the warp is the strings that are always on the loom, and that'll look kind of like a harp when you haven't started to weave anything yet. And then the weft is when you go in and you take another piece of thread and you weave that along the weft, and that'll go back and forth usually to create the fabric. So because that's what's happened here, you can see, if you look really close, I used pinking shears to cut this fabric for everyone. And the reason I did that is because this fabric has kind of a loose weave, meaning fabrics can be really tightly woven with really fine threads, or they can be much looser. And the looser they are, the more likely they are to fray. And fraying just means that the threads which make up the fabric will come apart from the fabric itself, and that just makes everything less sturdy and can compromise any seams that we're going to sew. But pinking them, which you can see makes this kind of triangle shape, it's kind of like craft scissors you might have used as a kid, but because it does every cut on a 45-degree angle, that means that it's less likely, the threads are less likely to come up out of the weave because they're not lying flat against the cut. So that should help us just to make sure that nothing unravels while we're working. So now that we know kind of how our piece of fabric works, how we're going to do this is we are going to take our long strip of fabric and we are going to fold it in half like this. So it's going to be the same length it was, but it's going to be half as wide. So you can take another look here. You definitely don't want to fold it, let's say, hamburger way like this. We want to make sure we are folding it hot dog way. So that's the same length it always was, it's just as long, but it's half as tall. So now that we've got this here, we're going to want to take our pins, and I'm going to give the little PSA ahead of time. These are very sharp, and they can very easily poke you, and especially if you just leave them sitting around. I know I plenty of times have forgotten needles around in places, and then found them with my foot or whatever, and it hurts very badly. So that's why I gave you this piece of felt, because every time we're done with one of these, we're going to make sure we put it back in the piece of felt so we know where it is and we know that we can be careful around it. So we're going to take some of our 5 pins, And we are going to try to evenly space them along the length of this fabric here. So I'm going to start by putting one right in the middle about, and you're going to want to try to make sure that you line the two edges up as closely as you can. You don't want it to be like this where you might be able to see that one side is a lot further in than the other. You want to line them up as well as you can, just like that. And then we're going to put one pin to hold that in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the pin and we're going to go down into the fabric, make sure it goes all the way through, and then come back up and poke it up through. So both ends should end up on the top, and that's just going to hold this fabric in place so you can see it won't move back and forth as we sew. So now we're going to do the same thing along the full length of this piece of fabric. So we're going to take the rest of our pins, and to get them evenly spaced, it'll probably be best for us to do the middle one, and then to do the two ends, and then to come in and put the other two sort of in the center of those. So we're putting this one here, and then we'll come to this end. We're going to pull it taut so you can see that everything's sort of lining up, because it is possible you could accidentally do something like this, and then when you look back, it's not really lining up. So it's good to make sure the whole strip is lining up while you're doing this. So I'm going to go in and go down and up, and that's holding that end in place. And now I'm going to move over to this other end. I'm going to smooth the fabric out, line everything up here as well as I can. I'm going to put this one in here, down and up. And now we're going to take the last two, and like I said, try and find the midpoint of the end one and the middle one. So that's right about here. I'm going to line that up, and I am going to put that in there. Take a look, make sure everything's looking right. All right. And then this other midpoint, middle and the end, find the center, line it up, down and up. Okay. So we'll move this whole thing through the camera here so you can see it all. So you can tell that everything's looking pretty smooth. There's no giant bumps or anything. That would happen if maybe we had pinned something in not quite the right spot. So this is holding everything in place for us. One thing to note about woven fabrics that have stripy patterns woven into them like this, one of the cons of that is that if you were matching two different pieces of fabric, you would normally want to make sure that the lines are matching up where one piece ends and the other begins. And that's really hard to do in sewing sometimes. It's called pattern matching. Thankfully, we don't really have to worry about it here, but you can kind of take a look just if you're curious to see, is your pattern matching where you've kind of pinned it? Like, is the black line, when you turn it around, coming around to the back side, and do they match up? They should match up pretty well. For this specific project, if they don't match up exactly right, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. All right, so next up, we are going to start sewing. So to start sewing, we're going to go back to this piece of felt, and all we should have left is the one needle. So we are going to pull out the needle and keep an eye on it. And then we're going to take our little spool of thread here, and it should have this tiny notch that's holding the thread. You're just going to want to pull that out of there, and that'll start unwinding it. And we're going to want to pull a piece of thread that is about the length of our arm. So if you hold one end and this here and put it at the start of your arm, then we will want to cut it once the thread hits the end of your arm. And that's just a general metric that people use to make sure that you don't get a piece of thread that's too long. because if your thread is too long, it'll have a tendency to kind of knot up on itself randomly as you're sewing, which can be a really big pain because if you randomly have a knot in the middle of your thread, it won't want to pull through the fabric. So sometimes if you can't get the knot out, you might have to just start all over and start a new piece of thread, and that can be really frustrating. So we've got as long as we can get it without being too long. And next up, we are going to thread the needle. There should be a little hole in the needle. You may be able to see it if I do this, at the top where it's gold. And so you are just going to take one end of your piece of thread and you're going to put it through that hole. All right, and the way you will know that you have it through the hole if you can't quite see is if you take the end you put through and the longer end and you pull it, it'll catch on the needle like that. And sometimes it can be a little hard to thread a needle, especially if your eyesight isn't the best up close. So you can always ask a friend for help, or you can, sometimes it helps to trim the end of the thread if it's frayed a little bit, meaning that it's kind of gotten a little bit fuzzy. It's not as small as it could be. If you trim the end a little bit, it should make that piece a little bit smaller, make it go through the eye of the needle a little bit easier. Also, this isn't ideal during a pandemic, I know, but you can lick the end of the thread and that'll kind of condense the fibers as well, and that'll make it also easier to put through the eye. So we're taking the end we put through and having that be just a few inches long, and then you have the longer end of the thread down here, and this is going to kind of be our running thread as we sew. So what we're going to do next is we're going to put a knot in the bottom of this longer bit of thread, because once we sew, if we didn't put a knot in it, if we continued to pull it, the thread just wouldn't catch and it would come out as we went. So I'm going to show you guys the way I knot my thread. If it doesn't make sense to you, there's a bunch of different other ways to do it, and in the description of this video or in the same blog post I put the video in, I'll link a couple of other videos of different ways you can do this. Really all you need is to get a knot that prevents the thread from pulling through the fabric. So you could even just do a regular knot. It's just once you get the hang of this sort of thing, it's a little bit quicker. So I'll show you what I'm doing. I am taking the thread and I'm putting it over my two fingers here, and I'm grabbing it with my thumb. I know I have funky thumbs. And I go around and up, and once I've got both of those under my thumb and my fingers, I roll it in between my fingers and I grab this and I pull it through to the other side, and that creates my knot. So like I said, I'll post some video tutorials for that because I know it can be kind of confusing at first, but I've got my knot now. So I've got the knot on my long end and I've got my needle on the other end. So we are going to stitch along the long pinked side. We're not going to do anything to the short end yet, so you can just leave those alone. We don't want to sew those shut yet because we're going to put the elastic through there. So really we're just going to work our way down this entire long edge. So it will take a little while because we're hand sewing. If you're sewing by machine, it would be quicker. If you know how to sew by machine, you can if you want. It'll just be the difference between it taking a couple seconds and several minutes to do it by hand. But doing it by hand can be really rewarding. So I'm going to show you how to do a back stitch. So a back stitch just means that every time we pull the thread up, instead of continuing to move forward in the direction we're heading, we're going to come back in backwards towards where we started. So I'll show you exactly what that means. So I'm going to start by putting my needle in from the bottom going upwards. So let's say if we're talking in terms of the stripes, I'm going like 1.5 stripes in to start. And also how far you sew in from the edge we're sewing is going to be what is called your seam allowance. It's the space between your stitching and the edge, the raw edge of the fabric. Now we don't want to stitch too close to that because it's like I was talking about with fraying. If you stitch too close to it, the fabric, if it frays, is more likely to compromise the stitching and some of your seams could fall apart. So we want to make sure we're at least a little bit in from there. So the best way to determine that is if you look at your fabric. So since I've got these stripes here, they can kind of guide me. I think if I am about, let's see, this far in, I should be fine. So I am going to sew, therefore, along probably the bottom edge, maybe the middle of this black line as I go. And it's like I was saying, because the pattern is woven into this fabric, we can use the lines as a guide. If it was a printed stripe, I might be a little more wary of doing that because things can be printed on fabrics not exactly evenly, so you might not want to use that as a guide, but in this scenario we can. Now yours might not look exactly the same as me. You might have a white stripe where this black one is, but if you can just get a feel for about a stripe and a half down, that's where we're going to want to be stitching. So for me, I'll keep talking about this black stripe and I'll follow that, but for you it might be different. It might be a white stripe you're following. Just about a stripe and a half in is what we're going to be following. I'm going to start by going up into the black stripe, towards the bottom of it there I'm doing, and up through the fabric, and I'm going to pull it until the knot catches. So I can see that it's stopped, and that means the knot has caught. If it pulls all the way through and comes out, that just means you need a bigger knot. So if you just did one knot, you could do another knot on top of that, and then that should catch. But now what we're doing, which is what defines the back stitch, is if we were doing, say, a running stitch, we would just continue to go down and up and down and up and down and up in the direction we were sewing. But we're going to be doing a back stitch because that makes your stitch even stronger because you're kind of doing double stitching. And in this scenario, since we're just stitching one line, the back stitch will really be a good option for us to make sure that we have sewn a strong seam, which will keep the whole scrunchie from kind of falling apart. So now that we've come up here, we're going to take the needle again and we are going to go down behind it. And by that I mean, instead of going forward like I was showing you, we're going backwards towards where we started and going down into the same stripe because we want it to be even in this direction. We're only moving along this plane really, and as even as you can get it along this line, the better. But we're going to be going down behind our first stitch and then up in front of it. So we went down behind the first stitch. You can see it's coming down into the other side of the fabric, and then we're bringing it back up, and this time it's going in front. So let me do that one more time here. We go down, back up, in front. And then you're going to pull your thread so it's tight there. So that's one stitch. So, and you can see you want to pull it tight enough so that there's not a big loop, but you don't want to pull it so tight that it pulls the fabric, kind of like that. You can see the fabric getting pulled. And that's something you'll kind of get the hang of as you go along. In this scenario, it doesn't matter all too much because at the end we are going to be gathering the fabric all together. So I'm just going to show you a couple more times the stitch we're doing. And because again I was talking about the pattern and also the strength of the stitch we're doing along this pattern, I think the ideal stitch length, which is going to be the length of this little stitch we just did, would probably be one box long. So if you see this black box one stitch should ideally be about that long, and the next stitch should probably be about this long. If you do it longer, that's fine, it'll go quicker. It just means your seam will be a little bit looser and a little bit less strong. Now in the case of the scrunchie, it shouldn't matter too much because you won't be regularly pulling in that direction of the seams, so you should be all right. But just for the case of us learning and learning to do it well, I think we should do the smaller stitch if you're able to. So I'll do it a couple more times to show you. I'm going to go down, behind, and then I'm going to go one box ahead to come up. I'm going to pull that tight. Oops, see, it's trying to knot on me, but I can get rid of that by pulling on it. All right, so I'm going to pull that tight. The pin's getting in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and take that out because the stitches are starting to hold it in place. I'm going to put that back on the felt there. Alright, so here's my second stitch. Take a look at that. So then I'm going to go back and down one square and then bring it back up in front, one square forward. And then pull that tight. Alright, that's my tail getting in the way. Alright, so a couple more times. We're going back and down one square, and then up, forward one square, and pull that tight. It keeps wanting to knot on me. Maybe I should have cut this a little bit shorter. Alright, so just a couple more times to give you an idea. So we're going back and down, back one square and putting the needle down, and then forward one square and bringing the needle up, pulling it tight. Back one square, needle down, forward one square, needle up. And you're really just going to do this down the entire length of this piece of fabric. And I know that seems like a lot. It's kind of the nature of hand sewing. Thankfully, that's really the biggest thing you have to do in this project. So this might take a while, but everything else will be pretty quick. So I am going to get this finished. I'm going to get to the point, see if I run out of thread, because I think there's a chance you might run out of thread before you sew the entire length of this. So I'm going to get to that point here. I'm going to fast forward, and then once I hit that point, I'll show you what we'll want to do. So I've hit a point now where my thread is getting pretty short. It's getting a little bit harder to stitch with it because it is so short. So at this point, that means I want to add some new thread. So before I get ahead of myself here, I want to show you real quick what my stitches have been looking like. So I'm just going to put this needle in here, get it out of the way. So you should be able to see there, I've got one stitch for each box. I tried my best to go in a pretty straight line along that black line. It's just doing your best at that point. But then you see the individual stitches. If you flip it over, you'll see why it's called the back stitch and why it's stronger. For each stitch on the back, there's about two lengths of thread for every one stitch on the front. And that's really what gives this stitch its strength. So this is about where you should be. It looks like I'm about 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks like I'm about a quarter of the way done here when I've started to run out of threads. That means we might need to change our thread a couple of times throughout this project, which is just fine. So what you're going to do, I'm going to take this pin out because it's got stitching so close to it. The stitching should hold it in place. I'm going to put this back in the felt here, get these safely out of the way. Now I'm going to take my needle, which has the thread on it, and in a lot of circumstances you might want to do one stitch back to get the thread onto the less pretty side. It doesn't really matter for us because this isn't going, neither side is going to be visible once we turn everything inside out, but let's still do that. So we're going to take our needle and we're going to put it down and we're not going to come back up. So we're just going down into the fabric, pulling the needle, getting that tight. And then we're going to flip it over, and we're just going to take the needle, put that on the felt, and have this tail of thread left. So we're just going to leave this here while we get another arm's length of thread. So I'm going to cut this, and I'm going to thread this onto my needle. I'm going to do another knot on the back end. So really we're just doing exactly what we did to start over again. So I'm doing my knot here. All right. Now I'm going to flip this back to the right side just so I can show you. I'm going to put this up right one square ahead, where if we had continued sewing with that same thread, this is where the next time the needle came up, it would be coming up. So one box ahead, we're coming up, and pull it until the knot catches. And then once that's happened, we're flipping it back over, and you're going to want to tie these two together. You could wait until the very end and just let these hang until then, or you could tie them together now. I'm going to tie them together now just to give you an idea of what that'll be like. So you're taking the two ends and just doing a regular knot, bringing one over the other and then under it and pulling to make the knot, and then you're going to want to do that at least one more time, maybe two, to secure it. All right, so now we have connected the old and new threads here. So I'm just going to cut those tails, and I'm going to flip it back over here. And I've got my new thread. You can see it's all connected, it's strong in there. And then we're just going to keep going like we were. And you're probably going to need to do that, I would guess 3 times total, depending on how long you cut your thread. So every time you start running low, you're just going to want to take the thread you're using, pull it off the needle, start up a new needle, and tie those two ends together. So I'm just going to continue down the rest of this length, doing the back stitch like I was doing before, until I reach the very end of this tube of fabric, and then I'll come back to you guys. So I am back. I've sewn all the way along this long edge here, and I have my thread at the edge, and I am just going to show you how to finish off your thread here. So I've done my last stitch, these two pieces, and all I'm going to do now is I'm going to tie these two pieces together, just one regular knot and a second regular knot, and trim that. And set the needle aside, and now you have that whole seam all done. Oh, I have this one spot I changed thread that I haven't tied off yet, so I'm just going to do one more normal knot and a second normal knot. Cut that off as well. Alright, so now that I have this, we're going to need to turn this tube inside out. And this can get a little tricky, especially if your tube is even thinner than the one we're currently working with. The thinner the tube, the harder it is to turn inside out. But we're going to go to one end of it, and this end should be open. That's what makes it a tube. And we are going to flip the fabric so that the other side is coming out. So you can kind of see that we've overlapped it like this. So now what you're going to do is you're going to put your finger into the tube and your thumb on the outside, and you're going to pull with your finger the fabric through like this, and grabbing the outside here to make sure that doesn't bunch up on itself. And you'll just need to keep doing this. So get your finger in there, grab this outside part, and roll it up through. Alright, and I'm just going to continue to do that until the whole thing is turned inside out. If you have trouble with this, you could also take a safety pin and put it on one side of the fabric, and then you can just kind of grab the safety pin from the other end. They also make turning tools, especially when the tube is narrower and more difficult. That can be really helpful. But this one is big enough where we should just be able to kind of wiggle it. So you can see I've got it about halfway here. So I've got this I'm still holding on to, and I'm just wiggling it out like this. Every time I go in, I kind of have to work my finger into that because it does sort of want to bunch up the fabric, and you have to kind of work past that. But I'm just grabbing the tube, inching it out, working my way back in, grabbing the tube, inching it out, and doing that until the whole thing has turned inside out. So let me just finish this off here. Get the last little bit. Okay, so you can see I've got the pinked edge here, so that means I've turned it out the whole way. We've got our tube, and because we did such a good job on our stitching, this is the seam, but you can hardly even tell. You have to look up real close and really pull on it to see that there's stitching there. So now if you wanted to, if you're comfortable using an iron and you do it all the time, you could go ahead and press this. You'll want to have the seam in the center like this when you do that, but you don't really need to for this project. It's not necessary. So I've realized you're going to need safety pins for the next bit anyway, so I'm going to show you the other way to turn a tube inside out with a safety pin. So you're going to take one end, and you're going to put the safety pin through it, just through one layer. You're not going to want to put it through the entire tube. So you can see it's just through this one layer here. All right, and I'm going to close the safety pin. Now I'm going to tuck the safety pin into the tube, and I'm going to bunch it up. As I follow, I can feel the safety pin right here. You can sort of see it. So I'm bunching it up as I go, and I can feel the safety pin working all the way down. And now I'm just pulling all of this bunched up part out. So I'm continuing down till I come out the other side. Now I just have to kind of carefully take this and work it out. And you can see that was a lot quicker than the other option. So you might just want to do that. But both ways work just fine. So we're going to take the safety pin off now. We're going to take our elastic. And we're going to put the safety pin through the end of the elastic. Be careful with this, it's obviously sharp too. Put it through the end of the elastic and close it. And now we are going to put the safety pin end into the tube. And we're going to kind of push the elastic into the tube until the end of it is right about at the end of the gingham fabric tube. So you can see it's just barely sticking out there. So I'm going to take one of these pins again, and I'm just going to put that in there to hold it in place. Alright, you can see it's just kind of holding that so it's not moving around at all. So now I'm going to go back in. I'm going to feel for that safety pin again. I can feel it right here. And I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before, where I'm going to bunch it until I get to the end. Push this back. Get to the end. Alright, and now that I've come through the other side, get that thread out of the way. Alright, now this is sticking out here. So another thing you might want to do at this point is ideally the elastic shouldn't be twisted in the fabric. So you can kind of feel for it and see if it seems like it's lying flat in there with the two sides pinned down. And if you feel a twist, you can just sort of twist it like that. It's not the biggest deal, it just makes things lie a little nicer if you can get it flat. Alright, so I've got that all set. The bunching is starting, which is kind of the backbone of the scrunchie, so this is good. So now that we have this sticking out here, we're going to go back to the other side where we've got our elastic sticking out. We're going to grab that end. Now that I've got it sticking out pretty well and I've got it solid, I'm going to take the pin out, put that back in the felt, and I'm going to lay the two ends over each other to create a loop. I'm going to take this pin out of here, get it out of the way. Make sure you don't lose the elastic in the fabric or you'll have to pull it out again. Alright, so I am, oops, here you can see here, I'm overlapping them like this. Now you're just going to take one of your pins and pin them together to hold them. Alright, so you can see that it's forming the circle there. So I'm going to now grab some more thread. You won't need very much at all. And I'm going to grab my needle. You might even have leftover thread from what you were doing before, and that's just fine to use as well. So I'm threading the needle. There we go. And I am tying a knot like we did before. And now I'm going to just stick my thread up through both of the layers here. And this can be a little bit awkward because you'll likely get some resistance because it'll probably hit the stretchy part, but that's just fine. You just might need to push a little bit harder. So we're going up. I'm going to try and make an X shape here, so I'm going to go down on this corner. And really you just need to do some stitching to hold these two pieces together. You could stitch in any shape you'd like. I like to do an X shape, so I'm going to come back up in this other corner over here, and then down in the fourth corner, then back up through the first corner I started with over here, and keep the fabric out of the way. You don't want to be catching the gingham fabric as you're doing this. So back up, and over to the second corner, down, up through this corner, I'm going to get the pin out of here because it's not holding anything anymore. Down through this one. Another thing you could be doing, another option, is to just go up and down across from that like this, and then just kind of work your way down the overlapped portions. And you'll want to do maybe 2 or 3 layers of the stitching. So if I were doing this, I would move down, and back up, and down, and that's just going to strengthen the attachment here so it doesn't want to come apart every time you stretch the scrunchie. But really, any sort of stitching here will work, as long as you have enough of it. All right, so you can sort of test it. It seems pretty strong to me. So now I'm going to bring my thread back towards where we started off, and I am just going to tie these two ends off. And trim that. Okay, I'm going to get the safety pin out of the way, shut that. Get my needle on the felt. Now you can really see things starting to come together. So the last thing we're going to do is we are going to take one edge of the scrunchie, and if you're okay with having this showing, you could just tuck this one into here and stitch around that. But in order to make things a little bit nicer, what we're going to do is you're going to choose one end of the fabric. I'm going to take this, and you can just push up through all of these layers and work the back stitch like we have right along here. That will leave this end sort of flat, but that's the easiest way to do it. What I'm going to show you, and what I think you should try to do if you can, is to just get the two layers here, and we're going to work all the way around here, and that should prevent this sort of flatness. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'm just picking up this one layer of fabric, and I'm going into the folded layer here. And we're not actually going to be back stitching here, we're going to be whip stitching. So I'm pulling this tight, and instead of going backwards and working like this, like we were, I'm going to just bring this around here and do the same thing I started with. So I'm picking up just one layer here, then going up through the folded layer and pulling it tight. And I'm just going to continue to do that all the way around here. So I'm going up through the one layer and up through the folded layer. And I'm just going to work all the way around the tube like that. You want to be really careful if you're trying to do it this way that you don't also catch the bottom layer. The only issue that'll create is that it'll give you the same flat look, which again isn't the end of the world. It's just not quite as nice as it could be. So we are working our way around. I'm going to leave the pin in here even though it's kind of in the way, just because it's keeping all the important stuff where it needs to be. So I'm working my way around this corner here, coming around the other side, just pulling up and up, all the way around. And it's getting stuck on the pin. All right, I think at this point I can take the pin out and it'll be okay. Let's take a look. Yep, okay. So I'm holding it in place with my thumb more now since I don't have the pin. Working my way around still, up and up. Here. And we're coming back around. And we're working all the way around until we've hit where we started. So I can see where I started because I've got my starting thread here. So I've only got a couple more stitches left. Make sure it's not catching anything. Do one more. All right, so now I have my thread right around my starting thread. So I'm going to take the needle off. I am going to knot those together 2 times, 1 and 2. I'm going to cut that. Alright, you can see that it closed the loop here, and now you have finished your scrunchie. So, you can wear it on your wrist, wear it in your hair, you are good to go. You can make these if you decide you want to make more. If you want them to be thicker than this one, you just need to cut them wider. And then if you want them to be bigger, this one should be fine, but say if you have really thick hair, when you're cutting the elastic, I gave you an 8-inch elastic. If you feel like that's not quite big enough for your hair, you could cut it up to 9 inches. But I believe this is 22 inches long of fabric. So if you wanted it to be even scrunchier than this, you could make that even longer. Or if you want it to be a little less scrunchy, you could make it shorter than 22 inches. And I believe this was also 3 inches wide to start. So if you wanted it to be wider this way, you could cut wider than 3 inches. So it was, let's see, 3 inches by 22 inches and then 8 inches of elastic to make this scrunchie. So if you want to make more, you can just make adjustments from there. I hope you have fun. Don't forget to check out our calendar to see if we have any other fun programs happening. Bye.